Okay. Um, so hello, creative writers. I'm back again with another interview with one of my writer friends. So you can hear from someone other than me about their process of writing and what they have to offer in terms of the craft of writing. So my friend today is Sean Hood. He's a screenwriter and an illustrator and a cartoonist. And I've known him for more than 20 years.
Yeah.
We were filmmakers in Los Angeles together. So we'll just start the way that I started in my other interview with my friend Lindsay, and I'm just going to first ask Sean. Sean, were you writing in high school? And if you were, what did you write? And was there anything memorable that you wrote in high school? And does it relate to the kind of things you write now?
Well, what I find is funny is, yes, I wrote in high school. I think most people write something, if only journal writing. And I always kept journals and wrote in those. And I wrote a few short stories, the kinds that would be, that were in the school literary magazine. And what's funny, when I look back recently at one of the stories that was published in my the school's literary magazine my junior year, and what's very funny about it is that, of course, it reads like it was written by a high school student. I kind of cringed when I read it, but at the same time, it contains a lot of the same sorts of things that my later writing would contain, just in a different way. Some of the early fascinations I had with certain things, fascinations with philosophical topics, fascination with genre stories like science fiction and horror, and other things like that were reflected later when I started my professional career as a screenwriter. It's very difficult to get work, so I sort of went to what I knew, and I was raised in very much a genre family. My mother was very interested in genre books of a certain type. She was an English teacher, so that they were more like the turn of the screw. And my father was interested in sort of Ed Wood B movies and Stephen King. So although I had those two sort of elements working for me, and but what was interesting was that I did not identify as a writer in high school. I think because we tend to identify in high school to a great degree with how we're perceived by others. And I was always seen as a painter, as a visual artist, and maybe a mathematician. But no one thought of me as someone who necessarily told stories or who was facile with the written word. It was, and although I did write a lot, I wrote through college, I had to write papers, and I continued keeping journals, but the journals were always these very intense sort of personal screeds. And it took me a long time actually to work up the nerve and the ability to write for other people. It wasn't, some people, they were just born writers. They rolled out of bed and at one point, and suddenly they could just write and it flowed out of them. I didn't know people in high school had that experience of being writers, being told how well they write, and being sort of lauded for their storytelling. And that wasn't necessarily my experience at all. But as I got older and I discovered that I wanted to get into film, I discovered that the best place for me in film felt like it was screenwriting, even though I had very few writing chops. So what I had to do was I had to sit down and teach myself all these fundamentals of writing, and it was a slog. So it wasn't really until I was in my mid-20s where I taught myself to type. I taught myself all the sort of grammatical rules that I had not paid attention to in high school. And I'd always been an avid reader, but I spent more time thinking about how things were written and how I wanted to write. And that was when my writing took the transition. I think you become a writer when your writing makes the transition being sort of functional, just giving somebody else information or writing things down in an academic way, to being a kind of something that you want to show to other people, something that's a mode of communication with other people. And I think in some ways, I was too shy in high school to go to writing because I wasn't as comfortable with it. People didn't see me that way, and it would be kind of going against the grain. I tend to write about deeply personal issues, so I wanted to keep it all to myself. It takes a certain amount of bravery to write down things that you feel deeply and then share it with other people. And I don't think I was ready for that emotionally in high school.
So when you did start writing, or thinking of yourself as a writer, what aspect of writing do you think did come the most easily, and what part was the most challenging? What did you have to learn?
The part that came most easily was visualization. Whether I was visualizing stories in terms of actual movie images and shots, or whether just sort of daydreaming through my story in pictures, so that when I had to describe the details of a scene or the details of a story for the sake of the plot or character, they came very easily to me. I already had these very vivid visions in my head. What came to me very slowly was the real workmanship, just the craft of writing, laying down sentences, making them as clear as possible. There are some people, again, who write in seemingly a very effortless sort of way, and it sort of flows out of them in these beautiful, dreamy, complex, compound sentences. And for me, I was only able to write by writing it once and getting it kind of wrong and it not being right, and then coming back to it and rewriting it again and rewriting it again. It takes me a long time to craft a well-formed sentence. I have to read it back and ask myself if it's saying what I wanted to say, if it's saying it in the most eloquent way, if some parts of it are vague, if I've blown some, if I dangle the modifier or those sorts of things. I have to keep coming back to and working through. So that was what was most hard for me, just the mechanics of writing. First, just typing, and then everything else.
So aside from the typing, do you think that there's something about the fact, you mentioned that you're a mathematician, that you were accustomed to being methodical about things, that had you have that determination to just keep working on that skill?
I hadn't thought of it that way, but that makes sense, because when I was doing higher mathematics in college, there's you don't solve problems anymore. You write proofs. Someone asks you if a statement is true or not, and you have to prove it one way or the other. And those writing proofs for me was very much a way of like going through it again and seeing if it made sense, if I'd made any mistakes. I'm very prone to certain types of careless errors. I'm a terrible speller. And the only way I could write the proofs was to go back over them again and again and again until they coalesced. Yeah. But that said, one of the things that rewriting gave me was I didn't identify as a writer, because a lot of times when I wrote, I could tell that my writing was a little stilted, that it wasn't quite saying what I wanted to say. And once I got in the habit of rewriting, I discovered that if I was patient enough and diligent enough to go through it 2 or 3 or 4 times, suddenly it's like almost like the text would wake up and become the thing that I wanted it to be in the first place. And so once I'd had that experience a couple times of getting there, so to speak, then I realized, okay, no matter what the writing project was, or even when I had very little time writing on a movie, I could have that sense of confidence that I know that if I just get this down and come back to it, even if it doesn't feel right, even if it's not there yet, it's going to get there later. And it may be very process oriented in the sense that some people, I think, have this idea in their head. They've seen movies where people sit down in hotel rooms with an old-fashioned typewriter, start at the beginning of their novel and type all the way through to the end, and then it's done. And maybe, maybe they do a rewrite where they circle things with a little pencil, and then type it up again. But that's not my experience. My experience is when I'm writing a story, I have to write it once before I even know what the story is. Yeah. I certainly do a lot of pre-planning, putting up index cards and mapping things out and where everything's going to go. But then it always changes as I actually start to write. And it's only after I've written it once that I can say, oh, now I know what's wrong, and go back to it. Yeah. A perfect example was I also write zines, and I sent a zine to you earlier this morning because I was sort of frustrated with it because I knew it wasn't right. So I needed a different opinion. And as soon as I got your feedback, suddenly what I wanted to say and the things that were getting in the way of me communicating that became incredibly clear in getting, once I had that feedback.
That's a great plug for having beta readers and friends and buddies to read your stuff. I want to go back a little bit to so you came from this kind of amalgam from your parents of like Gothic horror, and then you got this interest in science fiction. And a lot of my students, they love science fiction and fantasy.
Right.
And I've seen also in a lot of my students that they have that strength where I can tell they're visualizing. It's like the movie is unspooling in their head, right? We don't have schools anymore. But, and the biggest challenge I keep coming across with them is scene writing. And the funniest part is that Lindsay, who I previously interviewed, she kind of like came out of the gate able to write a scene, but could never write a story. And it seems like for you, maybe actually creating the scenes may have been part of the craft for you. Would you say that was?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Scene writing, figuring out how to, because a lot of times, what one has to learn to do is to learn to tell the scene itself as if it were a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And tell the scene with a sense of, okay, there's somebody in the scene who wants something and they're having trouble getting it. Something's in the way. It's a person, place, or thing that's stopping them. And either they're going to achieve what they want or not by the end of the scene. And then you have to apply that to scenes that, in the first draft are just two people talking, and they're talking about something, that's not even in the scene, something that's going to happen in the future or something that's happened in the past. But you still have to think of it in terms of what a particular character wants and ultimately to happen at the end of that dialogue exchange, and what the other person wants and how those two things conflict. I think that scene writing is often difficult for people who like to write fantasy and science fiction, in particular because usually the place that a lot of sci-fi fans and fantasy fans start with is world building. They come up with this incredible world with all these incredible details and all these incredible complexities. And they want to relate all those complexities to the audience. And so it's very easy for scenes to play out in a very expositional way, where just a lot of stuff is explained, a lot of stuff is explained through dialogue, and there's not a lot of drama to it. And and one of the most difficult things about translating science fiction books into movies, for instance, is that science fiction especially is so idea-driven and so intellectual in a certain sense, because it's so much about ideas, more so sometimes than individual characters and their changes and struggles and emotions. So what happens, especially, when I'm doing that translation from a book to when I'm doing an adaptation, I have to comb through the novel and figure out what that emotional core is and what those character drives are, and figure out ways to simplify an enormous amount of material so that the audience only gets the minimum effective dose of information about the world. Like, in other words, you don't have to know every single detail about a world. What you have to know are all the details so that you can participate emotionally in the story.
Yeah.
And that's hard. I mean, that's something that I did not know at all. My first attempts at science fiction were did not work for precisely that reason. They sounded just like I was explaining a whole world and explaining a whole a way a whole society on another planet worked, but the story never seemed to begin.
Yeah, and I love to encourage that creativity in the students, but then it comes down to that like very craft. Like, I'm not going to say I don't care about the world that you're building, because that is the exciting part of it, but there also has to be on the page characters that we care about, who are actually, where there's something actually happening on the page that I'm reading. And
right.
That's a lot. I feel like that's a lot of the work that we do together.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that one of the ways to get there is to ask yourself, what in my world can only happen in my world? And then ask yourself the question, okay, here's my character. In this particular world, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen to this character? And then when you start writing about those particular situations, suddenly you're banking towards the emotions of the piece, how the characters are feeling about a particular situation, rather than just explaining details and mechanics.
Nicely said. Thank you for that. Very relevant, I think, for a lot of my writers. So to kind of jump from this structural conversation to something else, why do you write? And why do you write the kinds of things that you do?
Well, it's interesting. When I got into, I came to writing from filmmaking, and I got into filmmaking because I was a visual artist and I thought I wanted to do production design. But what I discovered was the things that I most enjoy about movies are the things that are developed in the screenplay. The characters, the structure of the story, the conflicts, and a lot of the things that I admired that didn't seem to be people sometimes don't associate with the screenplay, like the visuals or the sound design, really did flow from the core of the screenplay. And so, since that was where the action was, that's where I wanted to go, and that's why I was so motivated to sort of to force myself to do a lot of writing and teach myself how to write, even though it didn't come easily for me. Because I wanted to be able to do that. I wanted to be where the action was.
Yeah.
And then other forms of writing really came as a result of, once I found my voice as a screenwriter, I suddenly realized, I could probably find my voice as an essayist, or write an article for a magazine, or do these other things. If you can do one thing, you could apply the same work ethic to learning how to write in another way. And so I think I definitely write to create architecture, the architecture of movies, ultimately.
Yeah. So we're running out of time.
Okay.
So thinking about one last question that you could answer quick.
Sure.
I guess, who are some writers that you like, or who would you recommend anybody read to learn about writing, either craft-wise, or if they're a craft writer, or just fictionally, or a screenwriter, someone who you really like that you think people can learn from?
Especially in high school, two writers that were very helpful for me in high school were Kurt Vonnegut, and I recently sort of reacquainted myself with his work because I actually did an adaptation of one of his novels, or rather one of his short stories. And for your sci-fi fan kids, I would recommend they read his early sci-fi work, because he writes science fiction in a very different way than a lot of science fiction is written today. And it's incredibly amusing and sardonic and ironic, and it's irreverent in ways that always seem to that appeal to people at certain ages. And I think teenage years definitely, but strangely enough, I think it starts to appeal to you again as you get middle-aged. the other writer was John Irving. And I would look at those two writers specifically for the style. They're like Kurt Vonnegut might be writing science fiction, but he's writing in a style that you just don't associate with science fiction. These very dry-witted, short sentences that always have a lot of punch. But he really does. It's like he's being. It's like he has to spend $3 for every word he puts down on the paper, so he chooses them wisely.
Yeah.
And John Irving also because of his style, he writes in a way that is extremely clear and allows you into the inner workings of characters' minds, so that you understand why they're doing these absolutely crazy things. And you can do you can learn to do what I think is most difficult for a writer starting out, is to encourage a sense of empathy for your characters from the reader. You want your reader to ultimately care about the characters that you're writing about. Otherwise, they're not going to care about the story. And that's difficult, and those two writers do it very well.
I never read much Kurt Vonnegut, but when I was in high school, I loved John Irving. So, yeah, and I don't know that people pick him up that much.
They don't, and that's why I chose those two particular. Yeah. I don't think a lot of high school students would have necessarily heard of them. Yeah. But if they picked up either either Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut or The World According to Garp by John Irving, I think they would suddenly, their heads would explode.
Exploding heads is good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All the time we have. I would love to do this again.
Yes, please.
Right. So that was Sean Hood, screenwriter, coming to you live from Los Angeles. And I'll be back next week with either another interview or another class. So till then, bye-bye.
All right, if you
I meant to stop the recording.